In the year 1212, when the winds carried both hunger and hope across the fields of Europe, and the bells of the cathedrals tolled above towns that smelled of wood smoke and sweat and incense, there began a murmur that grew into something greater than any sermon or proclamation of kings. For it was not the voice of armored lords that stirred the people, but the trembling faith of children, a faith born in the dust of villages and the whispers of prophecy, a faith that clung to the promise that God had not abandoned his people though knights had failed, and blood had been spilled and the holy city remained far beyond the seas, in the hands of the Saracens. And in the fields of Cloyes in France there lived a boy named Stephen, no older than 12, whose days had been spent among sheep and stones, and whose nights had been spent staring at the sky, where stars burned like the lamps of heaven. And to this boy there came a vision so radiant that he could scarcely bear it, the vision of Christ himself robed in light, commanding him to rise and proclaim that the task of Jerusalem belonged not to the proud, nor to the sinful, but to the innocent, to the children, to those who bore no sword and carried no stain of greed. And Stephen rose from his vision filled with a fire that no mockery could extinguish. He strode into markets where merchants shouted and coins clinked. He stood at church doors where candles flickered against stone and beggars held out hands. And he spoke with a voice that rang higher than bells, proclaiming that Christ had chosen him, that Christ had written letters in his heart addressed to the King of France. And though the king dismissed him as a child and cast him from his halls, the poor and the weary listened, for in his thin frame they saw something more than a boy. They saw a prophet, they saw hope, and soon the children began to follow him, leaving ploughs in the fields, leaving toys on the floor, leaving mothers weeping, and fathers shouting as they slipped away to join the holy march. And they clutched wooden crosses carved from sticks, they sang psalms that rose above the dust. They walked barefoot until their feet bled, yet still their eyes shone with light. And from tens they became hundreds, and from hundreds they became thousands, until the roads themselves seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their voices. For they sang of Jerusalem, they sang of angels, they sang of seas that would part as the Red Sea parted for Moses. And they believed utterly that God would open a path across the waters, that no ship would be needed, that the gates of the Holy Land would open before their innocence. And while Stephen's crusade swelled in France, across the Rhineland another boy named Nicholas of Cologne rose with the same vision, burning in his breast, and his voice carried across valleys and rivers, gathering his own multitudes, children and peasants and wanderers, all drawn by the promise of a miracle. And soon to tides of humanity marched from to corners of Christendom, to rivers of faith converging on a dream. And as they walked, the cities and villages stared in awe and in dread, for some saw in them the very hand of God, a living miracle, while others muttered that madness had taken hold, and priests argued from their pulpits whether this was holiness or heresy, whether the children were chosen or deceived, but no debate could halt them. Their songs drowned out doubt, their prayers filled the skies, and rumors grew along their path. Rumors of angels walking unseen beside them, rumors of sick children healed, rumors of the sun shining brighter upon their march. And though no one could know the truth of such tales, the power of belief spread them faster than fire, and mothers clutched their infants as older children vanished into the roads. Fathers felt both rage and wonder as they watched their sons disappear. Knights scoffed yet could not wholly sneer, for there was a terrible beauty in the sight of ragged children carrying the banner of God, with more courage than armies. And so the summer of 1212 became the summer of children, children whose bare feet traced paths across France and Germany, children who turned every town into a witness, children who believed they could succeed where steel had failed, and in their eyes burned not fear but certainty, certainty that the world was about to be remade, that Jerusalem would be theirs without a single sword raised, that the sea would open as promised and angels would lead them by the hand, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath as if every tree and every stone bent to listen. For in their singing there was both glory and doom, and though history would one day wonder whether their story was truth or legend in that moment, it was more real than any king's decree, for thousands of children were marching, thousands of voices were rising, and the dream of the Children's Crusade had begun, born not of power, but of innocence, not of wealth, but of poverty, not of armies, but of faith, and thus the first steps of tragedy or miracle echoed across the heart of Europe. It began not with a trumpet or a king-esque command, but with the soft shuffle of bare feet upon the summer roads. A scattering of children who followed Stephen of Cloyes in France and Nicholas of Cologne in Germany. Yet what started as a fragile thread soon thickened into a stream and then a torrent, flowing across meadows, forests, and villages until the land itself seemed to hum with their presence for wherever they went. The air was filled with voices that sang of Jerusalem high and thin, and unbroken, echoing off stone walls, and rippling across fields like the wind through tall grass, and at first people thought it a curiosity, this band of ragged pilgrims hardly taller than their staffs. But curiosity gave way to astonishment as the numbers multiplied, and the spectacle grew so vast that entire towns turned out to watch. And what they saw were faces sunburned and hollow, small hands gripping rough-hewn crosses, boys carrying sisters too weary to walk, girls coaxing little brothers onward, and though hunger pinched their cheeks and dust clung to their hair, their eyes glowed with a conviction that unsettled all who looked upon them, and whispers travelled faster than their feet, rumours of wonders along the way, of cripples standing upright, of the blind opening their eyes, and though no one could swear to the truth of these tales, faith embroidered them until they became living legends, and some swore angels moved unseen at the children's side, guiding them toward the sea that would surely part. And word of this strange pilgrimage climbed even to the towers of castles, where knights and lords exchanged uneasy glances, some scoffing that madness had seized the land, others troubled by the thought that heaven had chosen the lowly to shame the proud. And in the marketplaces merchants laid aside their ledgers to gape at the endless file of boys, and girls trudging past, poor and barefoot, their heels cracked and bleeding, yet their voices lifted in hymns that promised a city of gold beyond the horizon. And mothers along the way clutched their little ones close, fearful they might be swept into the tide, for already cottages and huts lay empty of children who had vanished in the night, drawn by a call no parent's hand could restrain, while fathers who once commanded obedience stood silent in their doorways, torn between fury, grief, and awe, for their children had become pilgrims of a vision larger than any house or field. And even among the clergy there was no agreement, for some denounced the march as folly from their pulpits, warning it would end in sorrow, while others whispered that perhaps the Holy Spirit truly moved in the multitude. And so the tide rolled forward, gathering strength as rivers gather rain, ungovernable, inevitable. And each night when the children lay upon the ground beneath the stars, their hymns rose into the sky like sparks from a fire, fragile yet undying, until even skeptics felt a chill of wonder. For what host of knights had ever marched with such purity? What soldiers had ever lifted such songs, and at the centre of it Stephen strode, frail but burning with visions, declaring that seas would open before them as once they had for Moses, while Nicholas walked among his followers with fierce confidence, promising that miracles greater than swords awaited them, and the children believed. Oh, how they believed, for their misery hungered for meaning, and their poverty longed for hope. And in their dust-streaked faces and cracked voices hope itself took flesh. And so villages poured forth not only sons and daughters, but also beggars and broken folk, who joined the procession until the sight itself became legend even before its end was known. For travellers carried tales of an endless army of innocents whose hymns rolled like thunder across the land, and though many mocked, none could deny that Europe had seen nothing like it before. A crusade without laws, an army without weapons, a pilgrimage woven of faith and desperation. And though hunger gnawed at their bellies and the sun burned their shoulders, still they marched, growing greater with every step, until the movement ceased to be rumour and became a living force. Hope transformed into a tide, faith beating like a single great heart, and thus the Children's Crusade pressed forward unstoppable, each weary stride drawing them deeper into the mystery of their fate, each hymn binding them closer to the dream of Jerusalem, and though wise men muttered of doom, the children themselves heard only the voice of God urging them onward, onward, ever onward. The march that at first seemed like a fragile dream now wound across the land, like a river of voices and dust, and as the children pressed forward day after day, the reality of their journey revealed itself in both glory and hardship, for though their songs still rose with the dawn there, feet grew blistered, their clothing tattered, and their stomachs often hollow, yet the fire of belief carried them onward. as though unseen hands lifted their weary steps, and villagers that had once greeted them with astonishment now prepared food or water when the endless tide of children approached. But not all villages were welcoming, for some doors stayed barred and shutters closed as frightened peasants whispered that such a host of ragged wanderers would bring only famine and thieves. Yet the children marched on, sometimes hungry, sometimes cheered, sometimes mocked, but never deterred. And in their midst Stephen of Cloyes spoke with fervour, his young voice carrying a certainty that made the impossible feel near, while Nicholas of Cologne walked among them like a shepherd, urging the weak to hold fast and the faint to lift their eyes. And though no knightly banners flew, the sight of thousands of pale faces turned heavenward became its own kind of heraldry, a standard of innocence and hope that even hardened men could not easily dismiss. And along the road the children sang psalms and hymns, their voices quavering with fatigue yet brightened by conviction, so that the very air seemed to shimmer with prayer. And when night fell they lay together upon the cold ground, huddling for warmth, whispering their dreams of Jerusalem. And though wolves howled in the distance and the darkness pressed heavily, still their faith became a fire that held the night at bay. And in the mornings the sun rose upon a sight unlike any Europe had seen before, a multitude of the young, ragged and footsore yet radiant with belief, moving as though guided by a star. And though their path wound through forests where bandits lurked and across rivers, where crossings were treacherous, still they went on. And when food grew scarce they begged for crusts of bread, or gleaned berries from the hedgerows, treating every morsel as manna, a gift from heaven. And the very act of sharing scraps and water seemed to bind them tighter as a people. For though they had left homes behind, they found in each other a new family united by faith. And when they passed through towns the bells rang sometimes in warning, sometimes in reverence. And priests came forth either to bless them or to rebuke them. For the church itself was divided, with some declaring the march holy and others condemning it as madness. But to the children the voices of reproach meant little, for they believed themselves chosen, and the words of Stephen and Nicholas burned brighter than any sermon of doubt. And so they walked on, through rains that turned the earth to mud, through sun that burned their skin, through winds that cut like knives, and yet always their songs rose. Sometimes weary and broken, sometimes soaring and strong, and each song became a step, and each step became a prayer, until the land itself seemed carved by their passage. And travellers on distant roads spoke of them as one speaks of visions, describing a river of children that flowed unarmed and unharmed, believing in wonders to come, and mothers clasped infants tightly as the procession passed, torn between fear that their own might be drawn away and awe at the devotion, shining from faces smeared with dust and tears. And fathers who once scorned the weakness of youth now stood silent, as they watched boys and girls carry crosses heavier than their years, and though some mocked and scoffed, others secretly trembled, for it seemed that heaven had indeed chosen the least to shame the mighty. And merchants stopped their counting to marvel at the procession, lords frowned from their towers, priests whispered among themselves, and still the tide rolled on, unstoppable, irresistible. For though bodies grew weaker, the faith within them burned hotter, and though some stumbled and fell, others lifted them up, refusing to let their companions be lost. For the march was more than a journey. It had become a living sermon, written not with ink but with footsteps, tears and songs. And at night, when they lay exhausted beneath the vault of stars, their voices rose again, frail yet insistent, rising like sparks into the dark, until even the heavens seemed to listen. And in those moments faith was not a word but a fire, not a doctrine but a presence. And the children believed the world itself bent to their purpose. And in their young eyes every hardship was but a test that proved their calling true. And when rain soaked them and cold bit their bones, they remembered the trials of saints. And when hunger gnawed, they thought of manna. And when their strength failed, they thought of Christ bearing his cross. And so they pressed on, and their songs echoed across hills and valleys, carried by the wind, until distant villages heard them long before they arrived, and people whispered, "The children are coming, the holy march is passing," and thus the road unfolded, long and merciless, yet transfigured by innocence and faith, until it seemed each dusty step brought them closer not only to Jerusalem, but to heaven itself. And though shadows gathered on the horizon, they could not yet see the shape of tragedy. For in their hearts the vision blazed undimmed, the dream of a sea that would part and a city of God that awaited. And so they walked, unknowing yet certain, their voices weaving together like a single hymn that rose above hunger, above fear, above the very earth itself. The days that once seemed filled with the thrill of miracle began to lengthen into trials, and the laughter that had once accompanied the hymns grew thinner, as hunger carved hollows in the children's faces. For bread grew scarce, water fouled in the heat, and not every village welcomed the weary pilgrims who now numbered in the thousands. And where once doors had opened with gifts of food and blessings, now shutters were drawn tight and barns locked. For what family could feed so many open mouths without starving itself? And so the children trudged past fields of ripening grain they could not touch, their eyes hollow with longing, their songs faltering into silence until Stephen raised his voice and Nicholas urged them onward. And in those moments the march became less a celebration and more a crucible, a test of faith so harsh that even the strongest quailed and sickness began to ripple through the camp, fever spreading swiftly among bodies already weakened by hunger, and the sight of little ones collapsing by the roadside broke the hearts of their companions. Yet the tide pressed on, carrying the weak as best it could, and though many whispered doubts, still the promise of the sea parting for them burned too brightly to abandon. For each child clung to the thought that just ahead awaited the miracle that would vindicate their suffering. And yet in the villages they passed, men muttered darkly that the march would end in ruin. Priests thundered that it was blasphemy, while others, shaken, declared it proof of heaven's mystery. And thus the children marched through a Europe divided, their faith colliding with the world's suspicion. And though the sun burned their shoulders by day and the cold bit deep by night, still they moved forward like a river unwilling to be damned, and their leaders, though young, bore the weight of thousands of hopes, Stephen proclaiming visions of triumph, Nicholas urging endurance, and in their words the faint found strength enough for another mile, another night, another dawn, and yet the truth could not be hidden. Bodies fell behind, graves hastily dug or left unmarked, tears shed and swallowed in silence. For the tide could not stop, it could only flow onward, and each loss became a wound carried by all, though no one spoke of turning back. For to retreat was unthinkable, and so hunger and sickness became companions. And wolves followed at the edges of the procession, waiting for stragglers, and thieves prowled the forests, some stealing what little the children carried, others seizing the most helpless to sell into servitude. And yet the march did not dissolve, for though evil pressed on every side, faith bound the multitude together like iron. And at night their songs rose, thinner now, hoarse, yet burning all the fiercer for their desperation, drifting toward heaven as though each note were a cry for mercy. And some swore they saw lights in the sky, signs from God, though whether they were stars, dreams, or visions none could say. And others swore that angels walked among them unseen, carrying the weakest when their feet failed. And these stories, whether true or woven by hope, kept the march alive. For faith thrives on stories, and every miracle whispered gave breath to the weary. And so they staggered forward, no longer merely a march of innocence, but a pilgrimage marked by suffering. And their footsteps wore grooves into the earth, each step an offering, each cry of pain a prayer. And though the promise of Jerusalem lay impossibly far, still they saw it in their minds, shining beyond the horizon. And so the road itself became a kind of purgatory, stripping them of strength, of safety, of childhood, until only faith remained naked and raw. And in that faith they pressed forward, stumbling, bleeding, dying, yet never turning back, for to go on was all they knew, and the hope of God's miracle drew them like a flame draws the moth, relentless, consuming, unstoppable. After weeks upon weeks of trudging over endless roads, through forests that swallowed the sky, across plains that seemed without end, over bridges that groaned beneath the weight of thousands of weary bodies, the children at last caught the first scent of salt upon the wind, faint at first, like a whisper of promise, but soon thick and unmistakable. And then came the sound, the low, endless thunder that rose and fell like the breathing of some vast creature beyond the edge of the world. And though their feet were bleeding, their clothes in tatters, their bellies hollow with hunger, the children straightened as if lifted by unseen hands, for the sea they had dreamed of, prayed for, sung of in their hymns, now lay before them, not a rumor or a hope, but a vast shimmering truth. a boundless horizon flashing like molten glass under the sun. And in that moment all the suffering of the journey seemed as nothing, for here at last was the place of miracle. Here was the shore where God himself would stoop to meet their innocence, and open the way to the Holy Land, and the multitude surged forward, laughter and sobs breaking from cracked lips, songs rising ragged but radiant, until the coast rang with a hymn that mingled with the roar of waves, and they fell upon the sand, some kneeling with arms raised, others lying flat upon the earth in exhaustion and awe, whispering prayers that poured out like water after drought. And Stephen, thin and hollow-eyed but still burning with the fire of a prophet, lifted his arms toward the horizon and declared that the Lord had brought them to the threshold, that as the sea once yielded to Moses and Israel, so too would it open before his chosen children. And Nicholas walked among them, steadying trembling hands, urging patience, urging prayer, promising that the hour was near, and the children, their faces streaked with tears and sweat, lifted their voices higher, their songs rising with the gulls that wheeled overhead. And for a time it seemed as if the sky itself leaned close to listen, and the whole shore became a cathedral without walls, the waves beating like the organ of creation, the sand their altar, the open sky their roof, and yet the sea did not part. It lay vast and untamed, its tides rolling forward and retreating as they had for all eternity, indifferent to the cries of thousands of small voices. But the children would not yield. They would not accept silence as answer, and when the tide withdrew, bearing wet sand and glistening stones, they rushed forward with cries of wonder, crying that the waters were withdrawing, that the miracle had come, that the hand of God was at work. But the sea returned with roaring force, drenching them, knocking some from their feet, soaking their thin garments through, and still they rose laughing and weeping, declaring it a test of their faith, that the Lord would answer only when their hearts were proven steadfast, and so they lingered upon. The short days stretching into nights, nights into dawns, the horizon their constant prayer, and each sunrise rekindled hope, each sunset tested it, and though hunger gnawed ever deeper, though sickness still stole companions away, yet they clung to the vision, with desperate fire, believing that the miracle could come at any moment, that perhaps the next tide, the next prayer, the next hymn would be the one to break the waters wide. And villagers from the coast came to watch, some moved to pity, and all others sneering that innocence had curdled into folly. For how could waves be commanded by songs? How could the sea, vast and eternal, be swayed by the tears of children? And yet none could deny that what they beheld was unlike anything the world had seen. A shore filled with thousands of the young, ragged, emaciated, sunburnt, yet radiant with conviction, their hymns ringing against the crash of surf, their faces lifted toward heaven as though the sky itself would soon open. And for a time the coast became both wonder and warning, pilgrims of hope clinging to the edge of despair, for though the sea gave no answer, they could not turn back. They had not walked so far, suffered so deeply, to retreat into silence, and so they held on, some fasting, some fainting, some collapsing upon the sand, only to rise again when Stephen's cry rang out, or Nicholas's steady hand passed among them, and all the while the sea remained eternal, vast, unmoved, its roar mingling with their prayers as if mocking them. Yet the children refused to see mockery, only mystery, and still they sang, still they prayed. Still they believed, until the very air seemed charged with expectation, as if at any moment the tide would freeze, the waters would peel back, and a road of dry earth would lead them to Jerusalem, shining just beyond the horizon, and thus the shore became both sanctuary and snare, the place where faith burned brightest and where doubt first stretched its shadow. For in the silence of the waves some began to whisper, trembling, asking why the Lord tarried, why the promise did not break into fulfillment. But still they remained, still they waited, their bodies frail but their belief unyielding. And so the children lingered at the edge of the sea, caught between the glory of vision and the weight of silence, unaware that in this place, where hope blazed hottest, the first embers of tragedy already smouldered, waiting to consume them. The children had lingered so long upon the shore that the sand itself seemed marked, by their knees pressed deep by the weight of uncounted prayers, and the air heavy with salt. And song was filled with both desperation and unwavering hope, for though the sea had not opened, though no miracle had come, still they clung to the belief that God would not abandon them, and their eyes, hollow with hunger yet burning with a strange radiance, remained fixed upon the horizon as if the line where sea and sky-kissed would suddenly break apart and reveal the path to Jerusalem. But the waves only rolled eternal, indifferent, and more of their number fell, claimed by fever, by weakness, by sheer exhaustion, their bodies buried hastily beneath sand that would soon be reclaimed by the tide. And whispers of doubt grew heavier even as psalms still echoed, for faith, though fierce, can flicker when weighed down by hunger and silence. And it was in this hour of waiting, when hope hovered like a fragile flame, that new figures appeared upon the coast, men whose boots bore no dust, whose cloaks gleamed with richness, whose voices carried not the rasp of the pilgrim, but the smoothness of those long accustomed to command. And behind them upon the waters rode vessels, vast and dark ships, like crouching beasts at rest, their masts rising like spears, their sails furled like folded wings. And the men spoke their words flowing with honey, saying that God had indeed heard the cries of his chosen children, that he had sent these ships as answer, not by tearing the sea apart as in days of old, but by the hand of providence moving through generous captains and faithful merchants. And at these words the children gasped and cried out, for it seemed their trial was ended, their prayers fulfilled, the miracle come at last, only in another form. And Stephen, God yet blazing with conviction, lifted his arms toward heaven, proclaiming that this too was divine, that the Lord had tested them upon the shore, and now had opened the way not by waves but by wooden sail. And Nicholas moved among them, steadying their trembling limbs, whispering reassurance that this was the hour that their journey would continue, that Jerusalem lay just beyond. And laughter broke forth, laughter thin, cracked, yet more radiant than the sunlit waters. For after so many nights of silence, the promise of passage felt like deliverance. And they ran to the sand where the boats awaited to ferry them. And the merchants smiled with lips that concealed their thoughts, gesturing with wide arms, urging the little ones to climb, to trust, to believe. And though some villagers muttered warnings, though a few old men shook their heads and whispered of wolves who cloaked themselves as shepherds, the multitude heard only salvation. For what choice had they after so long, after so much pain? And one by one, then in throngs, they climbed the gangways, their small hands clutching the rough wood, their ragged clothes fluttering in the wind, their voices raised in songs that quivered but did not fail. And the ships creaked as they boarded, vast bellies groaning as if eager for the feast, sails rustling above like wings preparing to spread. And still the children believed as fervently as when they had first left their villages. For innocence cannot fathom betrayal, and faith cannot easily admit deceit. And they waved to those left behind, to the sick too frail to move, to the fearful who dared not trust the promise. And the shore that had been their altar echoed with farewells, with the last prayers of those who watched helplessly as the sea opened its arms in another way, swallowing not by miracle but by bargain. And yet the children knew none of this. They sang as the tide bore the vessels outward, their hymns mingling with the crack of rope, the groan of timber, the snap of sail, their eyes shining with visions of Jerusalem rising like a jeweled city beyond the horizon, while behind them the merchants whispered among themselves with smiles that held no trace of mercy. And the sea, vast and eternal, bore the vessels away, carrying within them not an army of holy innocents bound for triumph, but lambs delivered into the hands of wolves. And still they sang, still they rejoiced, unaware that the horizon toward which they sailed would not deliver them to sanctity, but to sorrow. For in the bellies of those ships, beneath the sails that now spread like dark wings, the first true chains of tragedy had already been forged, though the children's voices, rising in faith, had not yet heard their clink. The sails filled with wind like great wings unfurling, and the ships groaned, as though waking from a long slumber, their timbers creaking with the weight of innocence, newly gathered upon their decks. And the children pressed shoulder to shoulder upon planks sticky with salt, lifted their voices as the tide carried them outward, their hymns rising like white birds into the air, the sea echoing with songs of Jerusalem, though the horizon remained an unbroken line of blue. And for a time joy swelled greater than hunger, greater than fear, for at last they were moving, no longer stranded upon the shore, but borne forward upon the waters they had so long prayed would open. And they told one another in whispers that this was God's way, that the miracle had come not as parting, but as passage, not as dry land, but as the gift of ships. And Stephen stood at the bow of one vessel, his hair whipping in the spray, his arms raised as though he commanded not wood and rope, but the very elements, and Nicholas walked the decks, soothing those who trembled at the waves, steadying the littlest ones who clung to the rails, and the sea for a while seemed kind, rocking them gently, scattering silver fish that leapt in sunlight, the gulls circling above as if guiding them onward, and hope rose again, fierce and bright, drowning memory of dust roads and hollow bellies. And they sang louder, psalms that mingled with the slap of waves and the snap of sails. And the merchant smiled to hear it, for the voices of children masked the darker creak of greed below. But the sea, vast and eternal, cannot be fooled, and already its moods began to shift, for clouds gathered at the edges of the sky faint shadows at first, like smudges of ink, but swelling as day turned to dusk, and the wind grew restless, tugging the sails harder, bending the masts until the ropes groaned, and still the children sang their songs brave against the rising howl, though some clutched each other's hands more tightly, and in the creak of timbers and the slap of water against hulls there came a whisper, not of miracle but of menace. Yet innocence does not heed omens easily, and the multitude trusted still, praying that storms were but trials of endurance, that God would calm the waters as once he calmed the Sea of Galilee. And as rain spattered their faces and thunder rolled across the horizon, they lifted their voices higher still, hymns trembling but unbroken, until the very tempest seemed to mock or to echo them. No one could tell. The lightning split the sky like a sword, and waves rose like walls, and the ships heaved as if beasts trying to throw their burdens. And terror at last began to crawl among the children, though still Stephen shouted above the storm that faith would hold them, that the sea itself must yield to the command of heaven. And Nicholas gripped the rail with one hand while steadying the frightened with the other, his voice calling for calm though his own eyes reflected the storm's fire. And through the night the ships pitched and groaned, waves hammering like war drums, prayers rising like desperate sparks, some swallowed by wind, others carried aloft as if the very storm bore them toward heaven. And when dawn came pale and broken through rags of cloud, many children lay silent, too sick to rise, too cold to sing, while others huddled in clusters, their eyes wide with the knowledge that the sea was no gentle pathway, but a restless giant that could devour as swiftly as it carried. And yet even then, when fear should have silenced all song, some still raised their voices, hoarse but stubborn, chanting songs to steady the trembling, to remind themselves that they were chosen, that Jerusalem still lay ahead, and the ships pressed onward into waters dark and endless, sails torn, decks slick with rain, hearts battered but still burning, though in the shadows of the merchant's smiles and the unyielding vastness of the ocean, the children had begun their descent, a descent from dream into trial, from faith into the jaws of fate, carried forward not by miracle, but by storm, not toward Jerusalem, but toward a destiny neither they nor their leaders could yet name. The sea that for days had seemed vast, and solemn ally carrying the children gently upon its rolling surface, now revealed a face of fury, beyond imagining, for dark clouds that had once hovered distantly now surged like armies across the heavens, devouring the stars, and the moon was swallowed in their blackness, until the world was lit only by jagged swords of lightning tearing the sky, each flash turning the ocean into a white, heaving battlefield, and thunder answered in booming roars that seemed to split the very air. And beneath this dreadful orchestra the sea itself rose in rebellion, no longer a pathway, but a living beast, its waves rising like mountains, their crests curling and crashing with force enough to shatter the mightiest walls. And the ships that bore the children groaned in protest, their timbers bending, their masts whipping, their sails shredded like rags. And the children upon those decks, who once had filled the air with hymns of innocence, now clung to the rails to each other, their thin voices raised not in triumph but in terror, crying out to God for deliverance, to the saints for protection, to their mothers and fathers whose faces they would never again see. And the sea answered with no mercy, only with another crashing wave that swept across the decks, tearing children from their holds and hurling them into the abyss. And the night became a scene of chaos, small hands thrashing in the black, water voices shrill, and fading bodies swallowed in the churning foam. And still the storm gave no pause, hurling ship against ship, scattering the fleet, separating friend from friend, brother from Sister Stephen on one vessel raising his arms in defiance of the storm, calling out that faith would part the waters, as it had for Moses his words torn by the shriek of the wind. His figure half shrouded in rain and spray Nicholas on another deck binding himself to the mast, with ropes so that he might not be swept away, clutching children to safety as if by sheer will he could hold back the sea. And everywhere there was the sound of cracking wood of masts splitting like bones of sails, flapping like broken wings, and ropes snapped and lashed through the air cutting those who stood too close, and barrels and crates broke loose, crashing across the decks, crushing the frail who could not leap aside, and prayers rose like smoke from lips that trembled prayers, drowned as quickly as they were spoken prayers mingling with screams that no ear could fully bear. And the storm raged on without end in eternity of darkness and water until it seemed to the children that the world itself was ending, that heaven and earth had collapsed into chaos, and that no miracle would save them from the wrath of the deep. And when dawn at last bled into the horizon, it revealed a sea strewn with wreckage, broken masts jutting like bones from the waves, planks drifting in endless currents, and clinging to them small pale figures, children too weak to cry, their lips blue, their eyes glazed, while gulls circled above them shrieking, and the surviving ships, fewer now than before, limped onward, their sails tattered, their decks slick with blood and sea-water, their survivors huddled together in silence, too stunned for words, too broken for song, their innocence torn away by the night's terror, and yet among them some whispered still that this must have been a trial, a test of faith, that God had chosen those who survived for a greater purpose. But others stared at the endless horizon with hollow eyes, seeing not Jerusalem in their dreams, but only the cruel memory of the waves. And so the Children's Crusade was thinned not by sword or spear, but by the merciless hand of the sea. And though the storm had ended, its shadow remained in the hearts of the young, a wound that faith could not wholly mend, and the sea rolled on, indifferent, vast, swallowing secrets into its depths. For the ocean remembers nothing and spares no one, and yet the children pressed forward, their hope wounded but not dead, their ships scarred but not sunk, and they knew not that beyond the still horizon betrayal awaited, a betrayal more merciless than the storm. For men with smiling lips and treacherous hearts had already marked their innocence as coin, and so the path that had begun in faith and song was now carried onward by silence and despair, into a fate darker than the storm itself. The dawn after the storm had seemed at first of fragile mercy, for though the children huddled on the battered decks with hollow eyes and trembling bodies, though many ships had been lost to the deep, and countless lives drowned in the night, yet those who survived whispered to one another that they had endured a trial worthy of saints, that their faith had preserved them, and that beyond the horizon Jerusalem awaited with its golden promise. But as the hours turned to days and the days slid into weeks, the sea did not bear them toward the Holy Land as they had been told. For no coastline of Palestine rose on the horizon, no hills of promise gleamed, only the endless undulating sea, and the sailors upon the ship's men with rough hands, and eyes too shrewd to be moved by innocence began to speak less kindly, their words sharp, their laughter coarse, and their glances weighted with meanings the children could not yet name, and soon whispers spread among the older ones, the few who had lived long enough to sense deceit, that these were not holy men at all, that no vow bound them to deliver the children to Jerusalem, that perhaps the storm had not been misfortune, but providence revealing the truth. And as land at last appeared, it was not the sacred shore they had prayed for, but strange coasts unknown to them, shores of southern lands where merchants' banners fluttered, and there the truth was unveiled in its full cruelty. For when the ships anchored not before the walls of Jerusalem, but in harbours ruled by markets, the children were herded ashore not as pilgrims, but as spoils, their cries rising in confusion, some still clutching crosses carved of wood, asking why they had stopped, where was the holy city? And the men who had once smiled and promised safe passage now raised whips and cudgels, driving them down gangplanks as livestock are driven, and upon the quays awaited traders with scales and purses, men whose eyes gleamed not with faith but with greed, and there the children understood at last, in sobs and screams, that they had not been carried to holy battle but sold into bondage, their innocence transformed into coin, their faith betrayed by men who saw in them not souls but merchandise, and some were torn from their companions, brothers ripped from sisters, friends dragged apart, their hands reaching in vain as chains clattered and collars were fastened, and the air was filled with the sound of wailing, the salt of tears mingling with the salt of the sea. And Stephen, who had sworn that God himself had called him, cried aloud to heaven that this could not be the end, that surely angels would intervene. But no angels descended, only buyers who measured limbs and teeth, who asked after strength and youth, for to them the children were not pilgrims, but servants, not martyrs but slaves. And Nicholas, who had held so steadfast, clenched his fists until his nails drew blood. Yet even his defiance could not stop the chains from being clasped, and so the dream unravelled. The vision that had begun in fields of France and valleys of Germany was shattered on the stones of alien harbours. Innocence turned into currency, faith mocked by deceit, and though some resisted, though some cried until their voices broke, though some prayed until their knees bled on the stones, the betrayal was complete, and the march that had been called holy ended not in the embrace of Christ's tomb, but in the shadow of slavery. And the merchants counted their coins, and the sea, indifferent as ever, rolled on, carrying with it the last echoes of hymns once sung by children, who believed the world could be redeemed by their purity, but who now learn too soon that the world devours the purest first, and thus the children's crusade, born of faith and flame, came face to face with its cruelest truth, that innocence is a currency easily spent by the wicked, and that the very journey meant to redeem Jerusalem ended instead in the chains of betrayal. The end of the dream did not strike like lightning, sudden and absolute, but spread like a lingering poison through the lives of those children who had marched so far, who had prayed so fervently, who had believed so innocently. For after the storm had torn away half their number, and after the merchants' smiles had withered into the grim command of whips, the survivors were no longer a host of pilgrims bound for Jerusalem, but a broken multitude scattered into 1,000 sorrows, each path darker than the last. And the scattering itself became the cruelest wound, for to be divided was to be forgotten, to lose not only the dream of Jerusalem, but the companionship that had carried them through hunger, through thirst, through the endless roads. And now the companionship itself was shattered, replaced with cries of separation as brothers were dragged from sisters, as cousins were ripped apart, as friends who had sworn to walk together, until the holy city were pulled away into different directions by the hard hands of traders, and their voices echoed across the harbours like the keening of doves, faint and futile, and none who heard them would ever forget the sound, for it was the sound of innocence collapsing under the weight of greed. And though some among them resisted, clinging desperately to one another, they were beaten back with rods and lashes until the bonds of love were broken by force. And thus began the scattering as carts rolled away down different roads, as ships sailed into different harbours, as coins passed between hands to purchase not goods, but children, and the great company that had once marched in unity was now dissolved into fragments, each fragment carrying a piece of the broken whole. And the stories of their fates diverged so greatly that no chronicler could later gather them together again. For some were borne eastward into the sprawling markets of Alexandria, where the cries of children were swallowed by the clamour of 1,000 tongues, where buyers examined limbs and teeth, where innocence was not recognized as holy but as valuable. And these children became nameless among servants, their days reduced to toil, their nights to tears whispered into straw mats. And others were taken farther still, south into lands of heat and dust, where no European tongue was spoken, and there they vanished utterly, their names never recorded, their faith silenced, their memory consumed by distance, and others, too weak to be sold, were cast aside in alleys and marketplaces, left to beg with outstretched hands, their ribs visible, their eyes, hollow, their songs of Jerusalem forgotten, and in each city that swallowed them the innocence of the crusade grew dimmer until only the faint memory remained, and yet a few, through fortune or perhaps miracle, escaped their bonds and wandered homeward, gaunt and ghostly figures whose hollow eyes bore the weight of unspeakable grief. And when they returned to their homelands, their testimonies poured forth like poison into the ears of parents and priests. Yet many refused to believe them, for how could so vast a multitude have been lost? Without God intervening, how could so many thousands of children have been left to chains, to storm, to betrayal? And so disbelief wove itself into the telling, and rumours grew strange and twisted, until one story contradicted another, and some claimed that the children had indeed reached Jerusalem, though no holy city had ever welcomed them, and others whispered that angels had lifted them to heaven unseen, and still others said they had turned into saints in disguise, scattered across the world to test the faith of men, and thus history itself became clouded, truth blurred by grief and imagination. For Europe could not bear the naked cruelty of the betrayal, and so clothed it in myth, and yet the grief at its root could not be clothed, for parents still sat by their doorways, waiting for footsteps that would never return, staring down the roads where once the children had marched singing hymns, hearing only silence, and their grief became heavier with each passing season, and the priests who had once blessed the crusade now thundered that it had been folly, that such innocence had been misused, and kings shook their heads and muttered that God had not willed it, that such madness must never again be permitted. But none of these words restored the lost, none of these condemnations returned a single child to the hearths that mourned them, and in time the story began to drift across Europe like smoke, intangible, impossible to grasp and yet impossible to ignore, and those who heard it passed it on with trembling voices, embellishing details, altering facts, until the tragedy itself became a legend, a ghost haunting the age, and still the true fates of the scattered remained hidden in silence, for the children themselves were far from their homes, swallowed into the labyrinth of slavery, of poverty, of death, their cries unheard, their dreams extinguished, and though their names were forgotten, the echo of their innocence lingered, a scar upon the conscience of a continent, and so the Children's Crusade ended not in Jerusalem, not in martyrdom, but in scattering, in a slow and cruel dissolving into countless sorrows. And its end was not marked by one grave or one monument, but by countless unmarked places, by waters that held the drowned, by markets that swallowed the enslaved, by deserts that consumed the vanished, by homes left empty forever. And thus the dream that had once filled the fields with song was scattered as surely as the children themselves, never to be gathered again, except in the broken whispers of memory that refused to die. The Children's Crusade did not vanish with the last ship that left the harbor, nor did it die entirely with those who had been swallowed by the sea, nor even with those who had been sold into the dust of foreign markets. For though the bodies of the children were scattered and though their voices were silenced, the memory of their march remained, and like smoke from a fire it drifted back across Europe, curling into villages, cloisters, palaces, and markets, until the tale itself began to breathe again, reshaped in countless mouths, retold in countless forms, and every retelling became not a record of truth but a mirror of grief, of hope, of fear, of shame, for the story could not stay still, it had to be carried, transformed, made bearable, and thus it began its second life, not on the road to Jerusalem, but in the chronicles of monks, in the sermons of priests, in the whispers of mothers, in the songs of wandering poets, and the story, like the children themselves, was scattered and yet alive, alive in memory though dead in flesh, alive in ink though broken in truth, in the cloisters where the lamps burned low and the candles sputtered wax onto parchment. Monks bent over their desks and wrote of the march, some with trembling hands and wet eyes, others with stern pens that judged, others still with imaginations that softened the cruelty of the ending, and each line of script became a different version, one monk declaring that the children had truly reached Jerusalem, but had vanished thereafter in divine mystery, another declaring they had all been taken up into heaven before their feet could touch the holy land, another insisting that they had been martyrs, their blood shed like the innocents of Bethlehem, and others, sterner, harsher, condemning them as misguided, as misled by heresy, as punished for arrogance, and so the written record became a splintered mirror, fractured, contradictory, each shard reflecting a different vision of the same sorrow, and none agreeing on the truth. And when priests stood before their congregations, their voices echoing in the stone churches, they thundered warnings. This, they said, was a lesson to all who would mistake zeal without wisdom for divine command. This, they said, was proof that God would not bless the folly of children leading where men had failed. This, they said, was the punishment of Europe's pride, the reminder that salvation could not be won by the weak without the guidance of the strong. And the people, sitting in the pews, heads bowed, shivered not only for the souls of their lost sons and daughters, but for the thought that perhaps God himself had allowed their ruin as a chastisement, and yet despite the sternness of the sermons. Outside the churches, the story was told differently. For mothers whispered to one another that surely their children lived still. Surely somewhere in the east they had survived. Perhaps as hidden saints, perhaps as pilgrims still on the march, perhaps as angels now walking. Unseen, and fathers who could not bear the shame of defeat insisted that no, their sons had not been duped or sold, they had been chosen by God for a purpose. To wholly for earthly eyes, and so in the homes of Europe denial and hope kept the story alive. Meanwhile in the courts of kings and princes, the tale was told with scorn. For rulers who measured strength in armies and fortresses laughed bitterly that such foolishness had been allowed, and they declared that never again must Christendom squander its breath on children, that this disaster was proof of the need for discipline, for order, for proper leadership, and thus among the high halls of power the Children's Crusade became a caution, not of innocence lost, but of folly exposed. And yet even in the courts it could not be silenced, for some courtiers, hearing the tale sung by wandering minstrels, wept despite themselves, unable to keep their hearts from breaking at the thought of children marching into chains. And so the poets and singers, moving from village to village, town to town, carried the tale in another form again, for in their mouths it became not history but song, filled with imagery of white-clad youths, of voices lifted in hymns, of waves swallowing purity, of merchants with serpent smiles, of angels who turned away, and the listeners wept. And the children who grew up hearing these songs carried them in their hearts as warnings, as mysteries, as examples of innocence betrayed. And the story entered the bloodstream of Europe not as fact, but as legend. And as decades passed, the memory hardened into something ungraspable, half tragedy, half myth, too painful to look upon directly, too haunting to set aside. And it lived on in manuscripts, in whispers, in sermons, in songs, in rumors, until no one could any longer separate what had truly happened from what had been imagined, what had been endured from what had been dreamed. For some it was a story of faith so pure that it defied the cruelty of men. For others it was a warning against blind zeal. For others still it was proof that innocence itself could be corrupted and sold, and in every telling the children became less themselves and more symbols of purity, of folly, of sacrifice, of betrayal, of loss. And in this way the Children's Crusade lived on, not in Jerusalem, not in the Holy Sepulchre, not in the crowns of martyrs, but in the shifting tales that Europe told to itself. Tales that grew with every season, tales that haunted with every retelling, until the story itself became unkillable, lingering like a ghost that walks the corridors of time, unseen yet felt, fragile yet indestructible. And the children, though gone, marched still, not with feet but with memory, not on earth but in legend, their song transformed into myth, their suffering into story, their tragedy into echo, and the echo into eternity. The story of the Children's Crusade ends not with a clear conclusion written in stone, not with a single monument where pilgrims might kneel, not with the victorious return of a host carrying relics from Jerusalem, nor with the thunder of trumpets to mark their sacrifice, but instead it ends in a silence that is filled with questions, with grief, with echoes, with contradictions, and with shadows. For the children themselves had been scattered beyond retrieval, drowned in seas, sold in markets, lost in deserts, forgotten in foreign lands. And because their bodies could not be gathered and their voices could not be heard, what remained was memory, and memory is never steady, never whole, never without distortion. And so the Children's Crusade entered history only as fragments, fragments retold by parents who clung to hope, fragments recorded by monks with trembling pens, fragments sung by minstrels to stir the hearts of listeners, fragments repeated in sermons as warnings, fragments dismissed in courts as folly, and each fragment told a different story. And when all the fragments were held together, they did not form a single truth, but a mosaic of contradiction, glittering with tragedy yet veiled in mystery. For some, the Crusade was forever a tragedy, the greatest folly of an age already drenched in folly, a march of innocence betrayed by greed, a song of faith drowned by storm, a multitude of pure souls destroyed because men of power could not resist their profit. And in this telling the Crusade was a wound that never healed, a scar upon Christendom that should forever be remembered with shame. But for others, the Crusade was no tragedy at all, but a miracle misunderstood, a legend born of truth but transformed by grace, a sign that children unarmed and undefended had been lifted beyond the cruelty of the world and had reached to Jerusalem not of earth but of heaven, and so their story was not a lament, but a hymn, not a defeat, but a victory invisible to mortal eyes. And in this telling the Children's Crusade was a myth of innocence, not a history of disaster. And between these two extremes lay countless shades, some insisting that perhaps the march had never truly happened at all, that the records were too contradictory to, embellished to confuse, that the story itself was a parable invented by later ages to teach lessons of humility, of caution, of zeal misused. And thus the very existence of the crusade became a question: did thousands of children truly march across Europe in 1212, or had memory invented them, born from grief, from rumor, from imagination? And yet, whether it happened exactly as told or whether it was reshaped into myth, the power of the story could not be denied. For across the centuries men and women remembered it, spoke of it, wrote of it, sang of it, until it became woven into the very fabric of Europe's imagination, a tale half real and half dream, like the sound of bells carried by the wind, too distant to be sure, but too haunting to be ignored. And as the centuries passed, the Children's Crusade became less about the specific fate of those who marched in 1212, and more about what it represented: the vulnerability of innocence in a world ruled by greed and power, the folly of blind zeal unchecked by wisdom, the eternal tension between faith that aspires to heaven and flesh that suffers on earth. And in this sense the crusade, whether myth or tragedy, achieved a kind of immortality, for it asked questions that every age must ask again, and it whispered warnings that every heart must hear, even today, when scholars sift through chronicles and argue over evidence, when historians debate numbers and names, when skeptics dismiss and believers defend. The story lives on, because it speaks to something deeper than facts. It speaks to the eternal sorrow of children, sacrificed to the ambitions of men, and to the eternal yearning of humanity to believe that innocence itself carries power, that purity might yet move mountains, that faith might yet redeem the world. And so, at the end of this long tale, we stand as those in the 13th century once stood, uncertain, haunted, questioning. Was the Children's Crusade of 1212 a real march of thousands of children who perished by storm and slavery, a human tragedy written in tears and loss? Or was it a story shaped by grief into myth, a legend born not of facts but of longing, a parable woven by memory to explain what could not be endured? The answer may never be known, for truth has long since drowned with the lost truth, has long since vanished into the markets of the East. Truth has long since been blurred by the ink of chroniclers and the tongues of poets. And yet the uncertainty itself is part of the story. For perhaps the Children's Crusade is both at once, both tragedy and myth, both history and legend, both fact and parable, its reality broken, like the children themselves scattered across time, never to be gathered whole. And in this way the crusade continues, not on the roads of France or the seas of Italy, not in the sands of Egypt or the walls of Jerusalem, but in memory, in imagination, in the hearts of those who hear it told. And in this sense the children who marched so long ago have never stopped marching, their footsteps echoing still, not on earth but in time, a reminder of innocence betrayed, of faith both fragile and fierce, of dreams too great for the world to bear. And so the Children's Crusade of 1212 ends as it began, in song, in hope, in grief, and in the question that can never be silenced: was it tragedy? Was it myth? Or was it both, forever entwined, forever haunting, forever remembered?